Hey everybody, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. This space that you see behind you is going to be a thing of the past starting next week. This has basically been my second bedroom in my house, and next week I'm going to be moving into a dedicated office/studio space. I've converted my garage, and it's going to be my, my home away from home, even though it's just a few yards from my back door. But it's going to be a lot nicer, and it's going to be dedicated exclusively to producing content for you in terms of the YouTube channel, the Candid Frame, all the written content that we do. And I'm really looking forward to that, having that space. I have to move all this stuff over, so I'm sort of crossing my fingers that I don't have any technical issues in terms of hooking all this stuff up. You don't see it all, but there is a bunch of stuff here. There's a soundboard, there's a computer, there are speakers, there are multiple hard drives, and I'm not looking forward to taking that stuff apart and putting it back together, because there's almost inevitably you'll have some problems of things not working exactly the way they should. But I'm keeping my fingers crossed that by next Wednesday, everything will be set up, any technical issues will be resolved, and we'll get back to producing some great content for you. As part of sort of a revamp that we're doing here on the channel and on the show, we're going to be relaunching the Candid Frame email/newsletter. We're going to be sharing a lot of content on that. And if you're not on it already, what you can do is you can go to the website, thecandidframe.com, and go up here to the tab where it says newsletter, and you'll find a page there where you can give us your name and your email address, and then you'll be added to our mailing list. And as a thank you for signing up to the mailing list, we'll be sending you copies of 3 ebooks that I've written over the last couple of years. And that's just a way of me thanking you for providing me your email and for just believing in the work that we're doing here. So just go to thecandidframe.com, click on newsletter, give us your information, and we'll go out and send that to you immediately. But more importantly, look forward to a lot of great content coming to you over the next couple of weeks and months. Now, with respect to photographs, last week really sort of gave me the idea for the video that I wanted to do this week, which was this whole idea of layers. And I've talked about it before, but I think building on last week, I just wanted to sort of share how I think you as photographers can start trying to create these sort of layered compositions on your own, because it's a real difficult thing to do. And I am no master at it. I'm still working at developing the way that I see so that I can do it. But I'm just going to share what I know and what I try to apply using 3 images that were kindly submitted by listeners here to our Flickr pool. So let's get going. All right, here we have a shot by Khanh Ngo. This was created with a Sony 6500 with a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second, f5.6, ISO 1000. Okay, so the main anchor of this shot is obviously the woman with the baby in the wrap, and the guy who I assume is her husband photographing the pair. Beautiful moment. I really like the body language, the expression of the woman as her photograph is being taken, and the way the photographer is sort of leaning back in order to get as much of those two within the frame. But we also have some other things that are happening. The most obvious of them is the woman who's passing through the foreground of the scene, listening to what I assume is an audio tour of the space that these people are obviously, visiting. And then behind them, immediately behind them, you get to see sort of the architecture. You see these columns here on the left, the column here at the center. I don't want to say it's stained glass. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe it's stained glass. Maybe this is an old church. So we have that immediately behind the couple. Then we have this other space behind them where we see the sort of the wall and the facade of the building here, and then what looks like to be a courtyard. And on the opposite end, we have the architecture of what I believe is the other sort of arm or branch of the church that they're visiting here. So you can see that this image consists of all these various layers, and it creates a sense of depth. It creates a greater level of interest in terms of all the details and how they sort of play off of each other, especially the second, the third, fourth, and fifth elements in the background that give you a really important and a valuable sense of place beyond the immediate action of the human figures in the frame. But going back to last week and some of the other videos, we often talk about being aware of your background relative to your subject. And a lot of the compositions that I typically see are very simple with respect to that. You have your subject and you have an interesting background. And the goal oftentimes is to try and eliminate all the potential distractions, things that could be immediately behind the subject or at the edges of the frame that would take away from the focal point, the subject in the photograph. Well, when you're photographing in a layered composition, what you're doing is you're adding a lot more stuff to the frame, and the hope is that they play off of each other, and that nothing is really distracting, and it's more informative of the people and the scene. And I think it's happening here. Now, how this moment played itself out, I'm not really sure. I don't know whether or not Khanh was standing here. He saw this guy making a photograph of his wife and child, and then took into consideration the elements in the background. That may well be how this sort of played out, because I imagine that the two people in the middle of the frame weren't there for very long. So what he had to do here was create a composition that captured the body language, the expression, with all of those elements in the background. And even though we have different planes of background behind those two, it's still relatively two-dimensional. I mean, that area immediately behind them could have been just a simple wall with good texture and pattern on them. It's made a little more interesting because it has a greater sense of depth. But what makes the shot feel more three-dimensional is the presence of that woman coming into the frame in the foreground, who has no relation to these two people. It looks like she's just walking into the frame. And this is one of the things that you can try to use when you're out in the street to try and create those images with depth, because you come into a scene, you see the people, you consider the background, and that's all well and good, and 90% of the time, that's all we have to work with respect to building a composition. But if you're shooting on the street and you're far enough away from the subject, there'll be moments where people will walk in front of us, and usually you want to avoid that because you don't want someone in front of your lens blocking your subject. But if you're aware of them before they come into the frame, you can kind of figure out, well, if they come in and I time it right, I might be able to place them somewhere in my composition in which they will add something to the photograph. So it isn't something that you completely want to avoid. You just have to anticipate when they're going to come into the frame and when you're going to depress the shutter release button. You can't leave this stuff to chance. And one of the things that works for me, especially in an area that's really busy with traffic, is that I can take some test shots to get a sense of, okay, when can I expect someone who's just at the periphery of my frame actually coming in, and sort of time it so that when I press the shutter release button, they're exactly where I want them to be. Because if there were several people walking through this scene, that would give me enough time to sort of figure out, okay, when do I depress the shutter release button, right? Because that's the trick here, because the real challenge here is because the woman wearing the headphones is so close to the camera, she's going to be moving past this scene really quickly, and it's going to appear so through the viewfinder of your camera, unlike the sort of fixed figures that you have in the middle ground and in the background. So you really have to be conscious of that timing thing, but that only comes with practice. But this is something that you could put into practice anytime you go on into the street, where you find an interesting subject, you have an interesting background, and take that shot, but then sort of linger there for a little longer and see whether or not having someone walking through the foreground can add something to the photograph and the composition to make it that much more interesting. You'll fail a lot. It's not always going to work, but that's the point of practicing, because after a time, it will become almost an intuitive thing, and you'll be able to gauge all of those different elements, particularly the ones that are moving through the frame, and figure out exactly when you need to press the button to get the shot. Okay, here we have a shot by Shel Serkin. We don't have any XF data here. So here's a shot where the main elements of the scene are fixed. We have this young couple sitting in a subway car. We have the subway car interior, including the door, the sign on the door, the advertisements, all those different elements, right? So when you're composing this shot, you have the main subject and you have the background. Simple enough, right? But that window adds that third dimension. Now you're including whatever elements are behind that window, and now you have the potential of being able to create that image that is much more layered, that has much more depth. But the thing that you have to do is that you have to see that this is an opportunity, that this window provides you, if you're patient, the potential for another element to come into the frame to help sort of serve as a counterpoint or an added flourish to the shot. Because if you just took the shot and there was no one moving through the background on the platform, you would have those elements of the subway station in the background, and it looks like there's like a caution gate or something in the background that has that, that crosshatch pattern in there. But Shel, by waiting for someone to actually move through the frame and using a relatively slow enough shutter speed that it blurs the subject as they move through and past that window, adds a great contrast to this couple who is perfectly still. They're just being this moment of being very affectionate with each other, or very tired, and they're just here. And I just love the way the girl leans over on his shoulder, and how he is sort of probably looking at one of the advertisements that are usually displayed within the car. But having that blurred subject through that window adds a wonderful element to it. And again, this is where it's important for you to sort of see potential. In this case, it's the window from the door of the subway, but it could be virtually anything. You could see a space, say on the left-hand side of the frame, that you have this contrast between light and shadow. So say you have a shaft of light that cuts that left-hand side of the frame into this area of bright highlight and then deep shadow. For me, that would have the potential of having a subject walk out of the shadow and into the bright light to serve as a counterpoint to something that was happening on the left-hand side of the frame. That's just another example, but it illustrates this idea that by moving beyond what's happening to the anchor subjects of the composition and exploring what else is happening in the scene, you can find those clues that lead you to realize, wow, I could do something really interesting and really expand the depth of my photograph by recognizing the potential of things in the environment and in the space, and then just waiting it out and allowing things to play out in order to complete the shot. Now here we have a shot by Nico Bernelli. This was made with a Nikon D7500 at 1/4000th of a second, f8, ISO 800. So this image is really, really nice, and it has all those nice layered elements that are really like in a shot, and it's so cleanly defined. This shot is very, very graphic. Not only do you have the contrast between the nun's outfit, that black headdress, the black outfit against the almost white, grayish tones of the surrounding area, but the shape of their heads and their bodies against all that lightness is really great. It's beautiful. And then on top of that, you have these really strong lines and shapes that are everywhere in this shot. I mean, you have the shadow here of what looks to be like a light or some sort of telephone pole. We have this another shadow here. We have the frame of the door. We have the tiles on the ground. You have all these other shadows themselves. You have this wall here and this sort of demarcation here of where this wall ends, and this maybe a glass or window with a sign there and another element of shadow. Just remarkable composition, because everything in this frame is meant to be there. It just feels like that. There doesn't seem to be anything extraneous in the shot. But getting back to this sort of layered idea, you can see here that imagine the shot without the nuns in them, without the nuns in the frame, and you can see how even without the human figure, you could see that layered composition. Right? You could see this one playing with a wall, with a door, this wall, this sign in the background. Now, this is where the challenge really begins, because building a really strong layered composition, at least for me, sometimes requires me to discover the scene even before anybody has walked into the scene. Because I'll look at a scene, I'll see what's happening in terms of light, shadows, shape, and line for depth, and then I'll go and figure out, okay, this would be a really good composition. Here I have all the basically the foundation of a good layered composition, and now what I need to do is I need to wait for people to come into the frame, for someone to put in my foreground, possibly my middle ground, in order to complete the shot. And what I think takes this shot to another level is that he has two figures here that help to provide that depth. You have the woman that's very close to the camera in the foreground, who's perfectly defined here in this area of the wall, and then this other woman here, who I assume both of them came through this door, and then this one made a right, and this one's looking over to the left, and I'm assuming that she's going to follow her, and they're going to move to the left of the frame. But their placement in the shot is just perfection, because look at what's happening here in terms of her head position relative to the background. You got this nice separation of the shadow here to just a couple of millimeters or inches away from her forehead. I mean, having that clearance there is absolutely, beautiful and critical for me in terms of the composition, right? And you can see how this woman also is really nicely defined by the shadow a beat later. And this woman would have been juxtaposed to the door, and this woman would have been juxtaposed partly from behind the door. And the whole feel of the shot would be completely different. And I doubt seriously whether that shot would have worked as well as this one. But the magic about this is that and I'm going to assume that Nico was really conscious of the area in which this scene was playing out, because of how well this image is composed. I think that his timing was just spot on. Like with the first picture, I was talking about timing. This shot demonstrates excellent, superb timing. Because when you build a layered composition and you include more than one human figure in the scene and you're trying to get them to play off of each other, it's all about timing at that point. But the thing is, you get to focus just on your timing because you've already figured out the rest of the frame. You figured out your overall composition, the placement of the shadow, the door, the floor, all of that stuff. You can do well ahead of time. All right? You figure out what your frame is, and then you just have to be patient. You just have to allow things to evolve and change as different people come into the scene. And he was just blessed with two nuns who were just perfect for this scene. I can't say enough about this shot, but you can see how developing this sensibility of paying attention to more than just your subject and your background and thinking about creating much more depth and layers can result in really interesting and exciting compositions. All right, I hope you found that helpful. It really inspires me to go out there and really push it to try and get these layered compositions. They're really hard to do, but it takes practice, and when it pays off, man, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But if you are new to the Candid Frame and you want to listen to a great podcast, well, the Candid Frame is it. And I do interviews with photographers every week, and I share them on my podcast. My most recent conversation was with Guy Webster, who is one of the seminal rock and roll photographers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I guarantee you, you know his photographs if you're a fan of the music of that period, because so many of his photographs, be it for the Doors, the Rolling Stones, the Mama and the Papas, those pictures are those album covers. And he has so many stories. So if you've never listened to an episode of The Candid Frame, don't miss this episode, because it is a great, great conversation. And if you like what you're seeing on these videos here, please subscribe and hit that little bell icon that notifies you in terms of the release of the videos each week. And I've also recently started activated the comment board, which you get notified of if you subscribe and hit that little bell, because it's going to allow us another way of dialoguing. But you have to hit the subscribe button and that little bell in order to have access to the comment part of this YouTube channel, if I'm understanding it correctly. But in any case, if you like what we're doing, subscribe, check us out, and I'll see you next time.